I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Josh Brown. I'm the administrative coordinator for the Department of Lifelong Learning here at Virginia Theological Seminary in Alexandria, Virginia. We really appreciate that you're here this, I would say this evening or afternoon, but the reality is we're all in different time zones. So whatever time it is where you're coming from, we appreciate that you've taken some time to be with us. And so without any further delay, I'd like to introduce Ann Turner, and we'll get started with our program. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you all so much for being here. As you know, whereas I hope you're in the right place, this webinar, it's sponsored by Lifelong Learning, but the content today is given by Deep Calls to Deep, which is a grant-funded initiative funded by the Lilly Foundation here at Virginia Seminary. We'll talk a little bit more about that in just a minute, but I am the program coordinator, and so in that role I do a whole lot of different things. I am an ordained Episcopal priest, and I have been preaching for almost 20 years now, which is crazy, but great. And I am joined today by my very good friend, Chrissy Crosby. And Chrissy, I'll let you introduce yourself.
Okay, hi, I am a Virginia Theological Seminary graduate. I graduated in 2014 with a master's degree in biblical interpretation, and Ann and I have been friends and have enjoyed collaborating on a variety of programs. We started off doing a lot of youth programs together, and since then we have done a variety of things. I sometimes am a facilitator or coordinator with Lifelong Learning, and always enjoy working with VTS. So I'm very excited about the fact that we're doing a whole thing on imagination in preaching.
So hopefully now you all are seeing a little bit of PowerPoint here, just to help guide us through the presentation today. Oops, except my PowerPoint slides, there we go. We're not wanting to advance. We've already had a little bit of welcome, just to say, if you haven't done so already, put your name and where you're from in the chat box, and be sure that your responses are, oops, let's get our screen back there. There we go. I don't know why I decided not to cooperate with me, but put your name and where you're from in the chat box, and be sure your responses go to everyone, not just to all panelists. So as I mentioned before, this program is sponsored by Deep Calls to Deep, and I was really pleased to see there in the chat box that some of our fellows, our past and current fellows, are participating. You can read more about Deep Calls to Deep on the Virginia Seminary website. It's a year-long program that is dedicated to forming preachers. And we take a class of preaching fellows each year who participate in an initial residency, a year of working in peer groups, and then a final residency. Deep Calls to Deep has four foci, I should say. One of them is spirituality. So unlike a lot of preaching programs, it doesn't look at technique as much as it looks at what is going on internally. Embodiment, which is especially challenging at this time, but focusing on how the preacher inhabits his or her persona, his or her incarnate self, to help make the word incarnate. Community, which again is a challenge in this time, but all the more important. No one should have to, of course you don't preach alone, but no one should have to prepare for preaching alone. But finally, the thing that we are talking about today, which is imagination. So we're going to do a couple of different activities today. I'll talk a little bit more about imagination and the rationale behind it in just a minute, but we thought the best thing would be to just start off with a little activity to get you primed. Hopefully, if you saw the introductory email, you know that we asked you to have paper, it's a notebook, and a pen that you really like to get you going. If you don't have those things, I encourage you to grab one now, to grab some. And we are going to read this gospel. Chrissy's going to read it out loud, and you'll be able to see it on the screen. But I encourage you not to spend too much time looking at the screen. Instead, listen as we hope that our people will listen with your ears. While you are doing that, take your pen and take your paper and just doodle, however you choose. This is not meant to be an illustration of the gospel, although some of the words might filter through and come out in what comes out. It doesn't even have to be a representational drawing. If you think, oh, I'm not an artist, this is not art, trust me. But just let your pen move, have it be touching the paper, and don't let it stop touching the paper while Chrissy is reading. So hopefully by now you've gotten your pen, you've gotten your paper. And this, by the way, we also wanted to be very useful. So this is coming up in a couple weeks. So the hope is that you'll get a little bit of jump start on your sermon preparation if you're preaching that Sunday.
A reading from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 20, verses 1 through 16. For the kingdom of heaven is like a landowner who went out early in the morning to hire laborers for his vineyard. After agreeing with the laborers for the usual daily wage, he sent them into his vineyard. When he went out about 9 o'clock, he saw others standing idle in the marketplace, and he said to them, "You also go out into the vineyard, and I will pay you whatever is right." So they went. When he went out again about noon, and about 3 o'clock, he did the same. And about 5 o'clock, he went out and found others standing around, and he said to them, "Why are you standing here idle all day?" They said to him, "Because no one has hired us." He said to them, "You also go into the vineyard." When evening came, the owner of the vineyard said to his manager, "Call the laborers and give them their pay, beginning with the last and then going to the first." When those hired around 5 o'clock came, each of them received the usual daily wage. Now, when the first came, they thought that they would receive more, but each of them also received the usual daily wage. And when they received it, they grumbled against the landowner, saying, "These last worked only 1 hour, and you have made them equal to us who have borne the burden of the day and the scorching heat." But he replied to one of them, "Friend, I am doing you no wrong. Did you not agree with me for the usual daily wage? Take what belongs to you and go. I choose to give to this last the same as I give to you. Am I not allowed to do what I choose with what belongs to me? Or are you envious because I am generous? So the last will be first, and the first will be last." The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God. Now, as a little bit of debrief from that activity, I'm going to ask you a question, and it's going to be the same question we have after all of the different activities that we do today, which is, what did you notice about the gospel while you were doing that? And what did you notice about the process while you were doing that? So what did you notice about the gospel? And what did you notice about the process? And I invite you just to put those things in the chat box, just a word or two. And you might want to specify whether it's something you noticed about the gospel or about the process. Did you notice it made listening easier, harder? Did it make associations you expected or not? Or the gospel, something that you might never have picked up on that you heard. Yeah, Donna put in there, made listening easier. It's interesting how I think we are such visual people. Oh, but this is, now Tim said it made listening harder. So that's good to know. It doesn't work for everybody this way.
And then Jennifer said, "I focus differently," so.
Yeah. We'll talk about this a little bit more as we go along. But you've all have probably heard that the two halves of your brain work differently. The right brain tends to be more visual, and the left brain tends to be more analytical and linguistic. And so doing something like doodling can activate your right brain in a way that simply listening might not. more focused on doodling. Oh, that's interesting. Noticing the rhythm in the text, making things seem familiar and strange at the same time. I like Keith doodled bunches of the grapes, which I think is pretty fun. Well, let me talk just a little bit about why we do things this way. And I'll get our PowerPoint back for a minute. So just to give briefly some of the theological rationale here about God and preachers and the imagination. And the first point is really one of, it's really theological anthropology, honestly. Something about imagination is a part of how we are made. It's part of God's gift of human nature. And if you think about the Bible, of course, it goes right back to the beginning. One of the first things that happens is there's Adam and the animals, and Adam is naming the animals. It's part of who we are to do this kind of creation, this kind of naming. And perhaps because of that, it's something that is deeply important. Sometimes we think of imagination as kind of frivolous or even decorative. You know, imagination is fun when the real business is taken care of. But really, if you think about it, imagination is quite urgent. And I think the best biblical example of that are the prophets. Probably a lot of people know Walter Brueggemann's book, The Prophetic Imagination. Without imagination, we would be stuck with the world as it is. But imagination, maybe a more palatable word for some people would be vision. Imagination allows us to tap into God's imagination, into God's dream for our world. It was interesting, the comments about noticing things in the new way when you doodle. One of the things that imagination does, which is traditionally the task of the anthropologist, but I think is our task as preachers too, is that it makes the strange familiar and the familiar strange. So it changes the boundaries of our world in a way that is really useful, especially if we are taking people who are so conformed to the world as it is, and we want to help them transform their minds. Imagination is the virtue that's being employed there. As I mentioned earlier, there's some scientific basis for this too. Using our imagination, using exercises that tap into our creativity, it accesses different parts of our brain, different neurological capabilities. So there are thoughts, connections, there's information in our minds that we can't get to straight on. Some of you might know Emily Dickinson, the poet, talked about tell the truth, but tell it slant. Using our imagination, we get to those things slantwise that are only available through that kind of peripheral vision. Neurologically, it also, it accesses the freedom to play. I'm guessing a lot of us are not doing a lot of playing right now, which stinks. And it's also a bad idea because when we don't play, we get very anxious. And one of the markers, for those of you who know, I think it's Ed Friedman says that an anxious system, people can't play in it. And so doing this kind of work, we're practicing playing, being very intentional about playing. And it gives us freedom and it reduces our own anxiety and other people's anxiety. One of the things that I think is great about preaching and the imagination is that it's not permanent. I feel really sorry sometimes for novelists who have invested weeks and months and years in one product. Preachers have the gift of disposability. Our sermons, I mean, they are like a good sermon might linger in someone's mind, but basically it's gone by Monday and we're starting over again. And while that's really hard in some ways, it also means that preaching is ephemeral and we're invited to start over and over and over again. Thank God it is never final. We can always imagine it anew. And really, to make the point there, this imaginative process, I talk about it related to preaching because that's what I do and what I care about. Honestly, it's useful in all ministry. There are ways of playing and ways of dreaming and imagining in pastoral care, in administration, in stewardship. Someone I knew once who was a staff manager at a parish brought face paint into a staff meeting and had this very large church staff all paint each other's faces, which is, like, how fun is that? So there's a lot of ways of tapping into preaching and imagination and joy. That's about all the direct talking I'm going to do about this, although it's something I care about and I'm glad to talk with anybody anytime. But we thought we wanted to use most of our time today trying out a couple of different exercises that will hopefully be useful to you in your preparation and maybe give you some ideas about other things you might want to do. So I'm going to do an exercise with writing. Then Chrissy's going to do an exercise with visual art. And then we're going to do something together a little bit with the physical reality that we live in. So I'm going to invite you to get those paper and pens back out again because we're going to use them. And what we're going to do in just a minute, we're going to show the gospel again. Chrissy, are we going to read the gospel through, do you think, one more time, or just show it? Can't remember what we decided.
I think this time we're going to show it.
We're just going to show it. Okay.
Right.
So look through the gospel and pick out a word. It does not have to be the most meaningful word to you in the gospel. It does not have to be the most important word in the gospel. It might be easier if it's something bigger than the, but it could be the if you want. Any word on that screen at all. Once you've chosen your word, we're going to set a timer. And if Christy and I can do this too, just write about that word without your hand stopping. You don't need to remember where your word came in the gospel or kind of what the right thing to say about it is, but just free associate. So if your word is vineyard, you could talk about your trip to the vineyard. You could talk about grapes. You could talk about barrels. You could talk about the letter V, whatever comes to your mind. And if you find that you've kind of petered out and you're just sitting there thinking, get off that train and get back on the writing train again and just start writing about a different part of your word. Don't worry if it's weird. No one will see this, not even us. No one's going to take a look at that. So with that, I'll put the gospel back on the screen and take a minute and find your word, because the gospel is going to go away so that you will not be tempted to be reading through it. So there's a lot of great and evocative words in there. And you can choose whichever one you want. And I'm going to stop sharing. And I'm going to invite you now to start writing. So you'll see Chrissy and me writing too. And we won't give you quite 5 minutes to make sure we stay on time, on our schedule. But take 2 minutes and we'll be in silence, which is just as awkward on Zoom as it is in person. And we'll write. All right. I'll ask you to wrap up what you're writing. If you have a really important thought that you want to get out there. But I'll ask you again to put in the chat box what, if anything, there might not be anything, but what you noticed about the gospel doing this, and what you noticed about the process. Something that maybe didn't come up in the gospel before, something that made connected somewhere else in the Bible, or this felt really good to let out your thoughts, or it was really hard just to sit there and write, which can be a reality. But just go ahead and put in the chat box whatever it is that your experience was. Oops. Okay, deeper focus, cultural relevancy. Oh, this is where it makes me sad that this is a webinar and we can't hear more about it. But if you want to, Christian, if you want to put more in there, I would love to hear that. Oh, and Duncan missed the gospel text again. I am sorry. It is Matthew 20. Oh, you got it in there. Great. Laura put she was surprised at the direction she took, which I'm glad to hear that. Surprise is good. Oh, and Keith, yeah, that to prepare a sermon requires one to have the space to freely play. And that is, it's sort of sad and yet so true that play can be so difficult. I noticed Chuck put down that writing took him away from the gospel. That can happen too. It's not always bad. Sometimes it's a detour back before, that takes you through territory you need to go to get back where you want to be. So it's just another tool for you to have for your toolbox. You can try this, or even a version of this. You can do it not written if you want, but just, I sometimes listen to the gospel in the car because that's when I have free time. And I talk to myself while I'm driving. So if you see the crazy person in the collar talking to herself driving, that would be me. Oh, great. All right, I'm going to get absorbed in these comments, but Chrissy, do you want to start talking about visual art?
I will. So visual art can do the same thing as word associations can do. It occupies a different way for us to be able to relate to the scripture that we're working with. And you can use any kind of an image to help you get into it. Anne, if you would put up the Van Gogh, for instance.
Sorry, it'll take just a minute.
There we
go on over. There we go.
So this is an image that Van Gogh painted. He may have been thinking of the laborers in the vineyard. I don't know. We were using it in an art and inspiration Bible study that we were doing with women who were in jail. And I was looking specifically for images of people who were working in the vineyard, who were actually working. And this was colorful. And so I want you just to look at this as an image, and we'll read. I'm going to read the half of the gospel, and then when we do the second image, I'll read the second half of the lesson. So as you're looking at this image by Van Gogh, Jesus said, "For the kingdom of heaven is like a landowner who went out early in the morning to hire laborers for his vineyard. After agreeing with the laborers for the usual daily wage, he sent them into his vineyard. When he went out about 9 o'clock, he saw others standing idle in the marketplace, and he said to them, 'You also go into the vineyard, and I will pay you whatever is right.' So they went. When he went out again about noon, and about 3 o'clock, he did the same. And about 5 o'clock, he went out and found others standing around, and he said to them, 'Why are you standing here idle all day?' They said to him, 'Because no one has hired us.' He said to them, 'You also go into the vineyard.'" So as you were looking at this, We're going to ask the same two kinds of questions. As you were gazing at this image, what did you notice about the gospel? Maybe what stood out for you this time through? And what did you notice about the process?
Christy, shall I stop sharing so we can see the chat box?
Sure.
Okay, just in case. I can't see it when we're sharing the screen at least.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, while people are writing, I'll just say I've seen that picture before and I saw stuff I've never seen in it. Duncan noticed there are a lot of laborers. Like there are a lot of people in that picture. I will also just share, I noticed how public that space is. It looked like there was a road going by. Oh, the sun reminded me of God's presence.
I like that.
Yeah. Work is hard.
Oh, Martha, I like the timelessness of their presence. You can't tell who came first and who came last. Yes, and vineyards require a lot of people.
Oh, this is interesting. Rosemary wrote, only one person is idle. Guess who's the overseer? Like, who's not doing the work? The idea that the sun is shared by everyone is lovely.
Yes.
Someone was also walking on the water. I missed that. Martha wrote that in the chat box.
Now I have to go back and look at the picture.
Yeah. The body is one. Oh, and this is interesting. Tim took that as the moon and not the sun.
Work through the dark times. Well, you know.
And Deborah wrote, it seemed they were all of color in the picture. Well, like Donna's note, there's a texture to labor. Which with Van Gogh, there's a lot of texture to labor.
Yes.
Slavery and reparations. I think it's interesting how Van Gogh can create a lot of associations with things that culturally and historically are not necessarily connected with Van Gogh. Reminder of slaves rather than workers.
Interesting. Nice. I like the Rosemary suggesting that the blocks of blue add some relief to the picture.
And Martha got music out of it, which I'm no surprise, Martha, that you got music out of it.
Right.
Oh, and water as a way to freedom. There's some great allusions and connections there.
Well, there you go.
Well, and all of this is making me aware of how when we preach, this has changed a little bit with COVID, but visually people are looking at one thing. They're not looking at a Van Gogh painting, but we have had the chance to go through that imaginative journey that people who are in a church looking ahead of the altar or the pulpit are not looking at.
Unless you're preaching at Virginia Theological
That's
Seminary
true.
in Emmanuel Chapel, and you can broadcast the picture, which I have seen done more than once. So, okay, so that was picture number one. And should we move ahead to picture number two, and we'll read the second half.
All right.
So again, as I am reading the second half of this, as compared to Van Gogh, James Van Eyck, I think is how you say his name, actually paints images relevant to the scriptures. And this is his laborers in the vineyard, day laborers. So as I'm reading, recognize that he at least is someone who is responding directly to the scriptures. And again, gaze through the images and just let the words flow over you. When evening came, the owner of the vineyard said to his manager, "Call the laborers and give them their pay, beginning with the last and then going to the first." When those who were hired about 5 o'clock came, each of them received the usual daily wage. Now, when the first came, they thought they would receive more, but each of them also received the usual daily wage. And when they received it, they grumbled against the landowner, saying, "These last worked only 1 hour, and you have made them equal to us, who have borne the burden of the day and the scorching heat." But he replied to one of them, "Friend, I am doing you no wrong. Did you not agree with me for the usual daily wage? Take what belongs to you and go. I choose to give to this last the same as I give to you. Am I not allowed to do what I choose with what belongs to me? Or are you envious because I am generous?" So the last will be first, and the first will be last. I invite you to consider what you heard about the gospel. What did you notice in the gospel as you were looking at these images? And did you notice anything differently than because of the process?
I don't want to take the image away, but I want to see what people have to say. I just noticed somebody, this might have been commenting on the Van Gogh, but somebody had a smell association with from the picture previously.
Smell, nice. We should experience scripture with all of our senses.
Todd said he heard their assumptions at work and their angst. The barrier that was on the ground, Paul noticed that definitely. Oh, and that's interesting. Work is always hierarchical, especially as we're about to celebrate Labor Day. It's, yeah, and Cheryl picked up that everyone is male who is laboring. Yeah.
Yes, I think that there are definitely overtones of migrant workers in depictions of different ethnicities in this particular picture.
Well, and a couple people just picked up on some of the visual cues, the separation,
right,
creating separate spheres, but also how linear it was, making it hierarchical, which is an interesting connection.
Yes, and having the vineyard be vertical with it. Yeah.
I'm aware as we're doing this, how a lot of this makes the gospel not simpler, but more problematic. The last will be first, the first will be last. Why are you envious? Because I am generous. But we're noticing a lot of injustice, a lot of hierarchy, a lot of things that make this complicated and troubling, which is not necessarily a bad thing. It might slow the sermon writing down a little bit, but I think it helps it in the end.
So now we're getting more of the chats coming through. To think about the two different kinds of pictures. And did you have a reaction to one, hearing the gospel? Admittedly, I broke it up in two, but did you feel that the images took you to different places with the gospel based on just hearing and seeing at the same time? And if that is something, can you compare the ways that you noticed things?
Because I think that question gets at the whole, the process and the right brain versus left brain thing, like definitely using our visual processing
right
takes us to a different place.
Oh, interesting. Thanks, Martha. One more, the Van Gogh, more about the work, the Janknecht, I don't know how he says his name, more about the relationships. I tried looking it up. I couldn't find out a pronunciation. Janknecht.
Hmm. Oh, it's interesting. A lot of people are commenting now on kind of their experience of those two paintings and their emotional reaction to those two paintings. And it's, I mean, it's interesting to realize just seeing an interpretation can stir up so many emotions in you. And that emotional content, I think, is really valuable for preaching. It's not a distraction. It's a tool. All right, I'm impressed that Christian is on here with a baby in his hand, which right there is a little bit of exegesis or a theological something.
And it's absolutely terrific that he's there with you.
Yeah, yeah. Martha, you're awesome, and we can do this anytime. That's Martha asked if we could do this regularly. Oh, and it sounds like this is really stirring up some powerful stuff for people, which is great. Oh, Frederica wrote about the men in the parking lot at the Home Depot.
Yes.
Around Alexandria, it's the Weenie Beanie, where all the day laborers hang out.
Down in Shirlington, yes.
Yeah, and that's it's always been just a powerful place to drive past.
Yeah. So before we leave the visual things, I would remind you that you can always just when you put the citation for whatever lesson you're looking for just into a Google search and hit images, you will find a variety of things. And even just going through those gives you a sense of how different people respond, and can make you say, how did they get that out of that particular reading? Because we're all different and we bring ourselves uniquely to scripture every single time we read it. So as I'm reading to you through this, I'm hearing different things myself. So I offer that to you.
There's a great comment in the chat about Keith does this for advertising Sunday services. So it's a twofer for your work, which is always good.
Yes.
Killing two birds with one stone. Yeah. And I will also say, Chrissy, what you were saying about other people's interpretation, one of the cornerstones of Deep Calls to Deep is this idea of community. And it's not always in-person community, but more the communion of saints, the idea that interpretation is a communal act.
It is.
Like eating two birds with one stone. It should be. It should be, yeah. Well, we want to do one more activity today. And this is, if you notice, we did kind of more of a language-based one, more of a visual one. And this is more of a chance to use your physical body. And especially because we've probably all been sitting for 45 minutes. And so, and Ronald, I just want to say, we'll do your question at the end, a question about copyright and permissions. But we wanted to give you a chance to get up and move around. And nobody can see you. So you are free. We had talked about different things to do for physical interpretation, and there's all kinds of movement that people do. There's yoga, there's a lot of walking around things that are very powerful. But knowing we had this webinar format, we decided we wanted to give you one of two options. And one is, especially if you have a laptop, just to go into a different room, find a different space than the one you're in, like physically get up and walk somewhere new. If that's not an option for you, or maybe even if it is, look around and find an object. It can be something you pick up all the time, something strange and familiar. It does not matter what it is. It does not have to be like a time card or something related to the gospel. I, in fact, am at a friend's house right now, and I found this, which I wasn't sure what it was for about 10 minutes. It's a French horn valve, because he plays the French horn. So it can be as random as this. Yes, some other more astute people than I figured it out. Once you are in that new space, or you have your new object, get out that paper and pen again, and we are going to go back to the gospel and read it through. Actually, we probably don't have to read it through in the interest of time, but I'll pull the gospel up on the screen, and we'll take a few minutes in silence, and you're goal is to write about that object or that space. I'm sorry, or to write about the gospel in light of that object or that space. It may be difficult to find the association between the gospel and the object, and that's okay. Again, no one else is going to see this but you, but what it makes you think of, what the connection might be. Again, we'll take a few minutes, we'll be in silence. Whatever comes out is completely fine. And when we're done, we will process that. So let me see, oh.
There it is.
So there, we've got the gospel again. This time I'll leave it up on the screen just so you can refer to it. But we will take a few minutes to go ahead and write. All right, and I invite you to put down your pen when you get to a good stopping point. And we'll just process this one briefly in the chat box. Again, if there's something new or different that you noticed about this gospel, or something that maybe surprised you about writing this way, especially if you had something random, if you were in some place where you don't normally prepare your sermons, if something was different for you doing that. I'll share as you all are putting things in the chat box. This practice, or a version of this practice, is sometimes more formally known as dislocated exegesis, which is a very fancy name for saying going to do your your Bible study somewhere different. Because, for example, you notice different things sitting in your study, sitting at your office, than you might if you were down at Home Depot, for example. So because we are incarnate people, incarnation makes a difference. So this is great. All my chats popped up at once here. Logan noted that the exercise is tied together, which is neat. This is really fun to see the stuff people got. A hat, a jade turtle. And Rosemary was out on her patio, which sounds really lovely. As we're throwing out these different objects that we made a connection with, I'll say sometimes this can feel a little bit random, or people can worry it's random. Like Linda's jade turtle sounded terrific, but people would be like, aren't you just like writing the jade turtle into the gospel? This is not meant to be eisegesis. We're not saying that, the extent of the truth of the gospel is the rock or the squirrels or the turtle or any of the things we've made, but rather it's meant to spark connections that might not be there otherwise, and to open your mind to things that are there in the gospel. You can almost imagine like it's shining light on a facet that maybe you haven't seen before. Someone picked up the guitar, which is great. So you can bring in music that way. I also noticed earlier someone talked about their Labrador retrievers, which of course, Chrissy and I are both huge fans of. Dogs are excellent sermon companions. Oh, a ceramic coaster. The gospel is not straightforward. Oh, this is and it's great. Connections to fairness and things. Headphones, making you notice or ignore things. I would just really encourage you to think about where it is you do your sermon preparation. And it's very easy to fall into the habit of going to the same space and therefore always thinking the same way. I've told this story in a number of settings, but a few years ago, I used to get in the habit of, I would work on my sermon and I would get really frustrated. So I would go out to run and then I would get ideas for my sermon. And it took me a couple months before I realized I didn't need to do the part where I sat in my study and got frustrated. I could just go for a run. And that really counted. I felt like I needed someone to give me permission, but it was legit working on my sermon. Oh, I just noticed Paul wrote picking up a quarter, and the images that are there. And it's great when, especially if you have a familiar object that everyone else knows, then that can wind up becoming a part of your sermon as well. Oh, Martha sings while she swims laps. That makes me very happy. Oh, and children's Tylenol. Oh, Christian, I hope your baby is okay. If that's what you've got in your hand.
I have to say, I love Jennifer's statement. She says, a ceramic coaster taught me that the daily wage can be for anything, but who pays for it? Why do we so confuse fairness with generosity? And that, yes, that's a wonderful observation. Thank you.
Well, we are close to the end of our hour. And so I just wanted to allow a little bit of, my computer, there we go, wrap up time. I'll take this down in a minute and we can have any final questions. But just to let you know that there's some more upcoming opportunities like this. Lifelong learning is fantastic, I think. No self-promotion there, but lifelong learning is great and has a ton of different resources. Coming up, there is one very soon about planning for Advent and Christmas, which I know for a lot of you who have liturgical responsibilities is probably weighing heavily on your heart right now. I am helping Ruthanna Hook, who's one of our professors of preaching, do one in October, right around St. Francis Day, called This Fragile Earth. And it's meant to address preaching the twin crises of pandemic and climate change. So hopefully that's something you're thinking about with St. Francis Day. And then something we did before Easter and worked out surprisingly well online is Deep Calls to Deep is offering a virtual retreat in preparation for Advent and Christmas. So that'll be longer. It takes up much of the day, but there's a lot of off-screen time. And once again, it's meant to give you what you need. It's meant to give you preparation so that those 5 hours will be well spent and you will have 5 less hours of work to do in the middle of December. You can see the links are there. You probably know them already if you found your way in here, but you can visit Lifelong Learning and Deep Calls to Deep and get some more information. With that being said, I think we would love to hear any last questions you all have, especially if we can answer them. Oh, great. And Josh just put the registration link up in the chat box. But anything else you all are wondering about either preparing sermons this way, or, and I think one of the things that Chrissy and I also talked about is that this is just, this can also be Bible study. You can do this with other people, and especially young people are always open in ways that adults sometimes are not. Oh, Chrissy, Ronald put up the question about copyright and sharing with images, and I'm wondering if you can speak to that.
So using it in your their fair use, I'm not an expert on this, I'm just gonna own that. But you're allowed to use things like we were for this class. It's a fair use of it. I would be careful. If you're pulling it off of the web, I believe you also can put it up on Facebook, but always, 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 when you use an image, please acknowledge the artist, a title if the artist does it, and any other information that you have, or link to where you got the image from. It's a very big thing. Artists deserve to get credit for their work, please. So I am Anne and I are both visual artists, just to own that too. So yeah.
But I will also say, I think this is true for, it's not even more true for me than for you, but we are visual artists. And yet, I mean, this is ideally a practice, a lifelong way of life, thinking this way and being creative. And even though I love it and it's fun, it's also hard to get myself to do it sometimes. And there's a strange sort of either guilt or shame or sadness that comes with that. But it is work, and you have to be a practice, you have to practice it. And so I wouldn't hesitate, and I would find other people to do it with. And I think one of the things we're all learning right now is those people can be on the other side of a computer screen too. Josh, you look like are you ready to say something? And perhaps it's about the follow-up email, or perhaps it's about your fabulous background.
Yeah, I'm getting some questions. I did mention at the beginning that this lovely space behind me and all around me is our new office here in the Addison Academic Center on the campus of Virginia Theological Seminary in Alexandria, Virginia. And so as the administrative coordinator, this is actually my work desk. It just happens to be a beautiful background to host a webinar. So I thought I would do that instead of doing it from home. We're really excited that everybody is here with us, and we hope you got a lot out of this presentation. If you did, and you'd like to spread the word, we'd of course appreciate that. The main thing I'd like to do now here at the end is just thank our presenters, Anne and Chrissy, for taking the time to share some of your unique talents with the rest of us. And as always, if you have any questions, you can send an email to me at lifelonglearning@vts.edu. And of course, be on the lookout for the next event. Thanks so much, everybody. Have a good one.
Thank you.
Bye.